Welcome to Opening Bid. I'm Yahoo Finance Executive Editor Brian Sozzi. Like I always say, this is the podcast that will make you a better investor. So be sure to hit us with those 5-star ratings on Spotify and Apple Music, and of course, those thumbs up on YouTube. We appreciate the love and support. Before I get to our feature interview of the day, have to do our stock of the day. And unsurprisingly, we're going back to the well. It is Nvidia, ticker symbol NVDA on the Yahoo Finance platform. Couple things that stood out to me today that is making Nvidia my stock of the day yet again, probably for like the 12th time in the past 3 months. One, you had the CFO, Colette Kress, longtime CFO, really well regarded at Nvidia, come out this week and say, we may be back on the hunt for acquisitions. Now, Nvidia has close to $40 billion of cash sitting on its balance sheet. So to hear Colette come out and say, we might put that cash to work to go out and buy another company, she has signaled another potential earnings driver or earnings catalyst for the company looking out over the next 18 to 24 months. Second thing that caught my attention, this week Amazon came out, new Trainium chip, talked about all its cool specs, all its potential demand, and Nvidia's stock did nothing. Actually, it did something. It continued to go up. Nvidia shares continue to outperform the S&P 500 so far in December. Stock is outperforming the S&P 500 by about 2 times. So Amazon potentially challenging Nvidia chips. Nvidia investors say, well, that's all nice and good, but Nvidia is still crushing. And last but not least, I would also keep an eye on Nvidia into Jensen Huang, of course, the founder and CEO of Nvidia, his keynote address at the Consumer Electronics Show, or CES, on January 7th. You could very easily see investors gobble up more of the shares into that event, making that event a potential sell the news type of event. Now let's get to our feature interview of the today. Really excited about this one, guys. Peter Zeihan, New York Times best-selling author, geopolitical expert. Good to see you. Welcome to the roundtable.
Thank you very much.
There's a lot of areas we could start with you, but I like a lot. Let's start on tariffs because It is such an important topic to our community here at Yahoo Finance. These are investors trying to put money to work. I mean, first of all, what do you think will go into effect?
Oh, I have no idea. Let's be clear. Trump has no idea. One of the big differences between Trump 1 and Trump 2 is in the Trump 1, there was a cadre of people who attached themselves to the president who had some experience in government and finance and everything else. That's not happening this time. Now he's just packing the place with loyalists. So we get the old style Trump where he tweets out a random idea that he has and then goes and plays golf. But there's no one to really pick up the policy and run with it this time. That doesn't mean there won't be tariffs. It means we just don't know. Don't look at what he says. And I realize waiting to see what he does is not great advice. Look at his schedule, because whoever he speaks with most recently, whoever flatters him most recently, they get their way.
Well, if there's not someone checking him, and Robert Lighthizer doesn't look like he's getting a spot inside the cabinet.
Does not seem like he's interested.
If he doesn't have someone checking him on tariffs, does that mean he can get really extreme because he really deliver on some of these claims he's talking about, 100% tariffs on China?
Well, remember, what we've learned between Trump 1 and now is that world leaders have figured out how to manage Trump. So, for example, right after the election, one of the first world leaders to call him was Zelensky of Ukraine, and he said all the right things. Oh, congratulations on your mandate. Congratulations on your crushing victory. Obviously, everyone in the United States finally sees things. It's like, you blow the right smoke, you get your way. And we saw, as soon as that 25% tariff issue happened, Scheinbaum called him immediately. Trudeau's changed his schedule to fly
Trudeau's
down.
having dinner at Mar-a-Lago? Exactly.
And that was all about proactive Trump management. So we're in this weird situation where everyone is trying to court the king, and they will keep doing it. Now, you can only do that so much. Wilbur Ross, you remember him?
Yeah, he's coming on soon with us. He's been on, yeah.
Yeah, he basically lived in the White House because he figured this out early on, and he realized that if he wasn't the last person to have the conversation with Trump, whatever he was trying to do didn't matter. So now we have world leaders doing that.
Has a trade war already erupted?
You could argue that. I would say that while Trump's tariffs from phase 1 obviously changed the conversation, and arguably in a positive way, what Joe Biden has done the last 4 years is take Trump's trade policies and make them more cohesive and coherent and really target specific sectors. I would be shocked if Trump did away with anything that Biden did in the field and just found ways to double and triple down on him. So the tech sanctions that we have seen on China are going to get more robust. And while tariffs may not be great for economic activity overall, the idea that they don't play a role in where we're going, that's just silly. And so seeing stricter and stricter things on countries like China for economic reasons make a lot of sense. And we're seeing kind of a flip of what we had during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the US said, you can have all your access to our market that you want if we can write your security policies. Now, we've got the Trump administration basically trying to reverse that. If you want a relationship with the United States, you have to give us this, 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 and this, and we will use tariffs to make sure we get our way. So it's not as crazy as it sounds, but it's also not as coherent as it sounds.
You talk to a lot of folks literally around the world. What do they think about some of the economic policies, tariffs, whatever you call it, tax cuts that the incoming president is floating?
There is a degree of resignation. American policy, especially American foreign economic policy, has been moving in a more populist, nationalist direction since the very tail end of the George W. Bush administration. It started with the disinterest of Obama. It went into tariffs with Trump. It went into nationalism and industrial policy with Biden. Now we've got Trump too. They no longer see Trump as the outlier, as just the most recent in a chain of developments, and they're broadly right. The Americans just aren't as interested as we used to be. And never forget that we hold up the ceiling for global trade, but we really don't do a lot of it. If you remove agriculture and energy exports, if you remove Canada and Mexico, you're talking like 5-6% of GDP is international trade for the US.
Are they scared of Trump?
Yeah, and they should be, but they were also terrified of Biden, because in Biden they saw a more competent Trump.
Interesting. How are they preparing for Trump 2.0? Let's just stay on the tariff front. Like, what are your clients talking about? What are they putting into action today to get in front of anything that may come January 21st?
It's a intensification of something we've been seeing over the last 10 years. In the case of Europe, you've got demographic collapse in progress, and so there's not enough people under age 50 to buy stuff anymore. So if you want to get on the right side of tariff walls, you have to start producing things in North America. The Koreans, and especially the Japanese, figured that out years ago. The Europeans are now playing catch up. Japan is a great example of this strategy in action. 10 years ago, Toyota's top facilities weren't in Japan. They were in Kentucky, they were in Texas. And so they've already gotten most of their industrial plant that matters where it needs to be. The Europeans are starting very, very late. You may have seen what's been going on with Volkswagen recently. We've got strikes. Volkswagen is trying to shut some plants, so the people who are working at those plants are striking, so the plants aren't, it's a bad plan. But they no longer have a market at home. They no longer have the energy from Russia. They no longer have sales in China. You're looking at an implosion of the auto industry in Europe, especially in Germany. There's nowhere to go except Mexico and the United States.
If we have this conversation 4 years from now, what do you think Trump has done to the United States in terms of like the world order? Like, where are we as a country?
The United States is going to be fine. It's really going to depend upon who becomes defense secretary. That is still very much up in the air, and having a nominee whose mom says he's an abuser of women is not a good look. But assuming we get somebody reasonably competent in that role who can kind of hold the line and maintain U.S. military operational capacity, I think that'll happen. The U.S. basically takes 4 years off. And in those 4 years, everyone else basically has to arm up. So we will have a much larger defense structure in Europe, which sounds great until you realize that probably involves a few countries having a nuclear weapon. We'll have a changed security environment in Asia because the demographic picture there is horrific, and it's entirely possible that we have a complete break in the Chinese system between now and the end of Trump 2. In terms of the rest of the world, nobody has a navy that can patrol their own sea lanes, and so we will probably have a trade crisis that is not directly linked to Trump, but the general breakdown in the international security environment. So we are looking at a transformational presidency, just none of these are things that Trump has specifically said that he wants.
Well, I share your concerns on these fronts, and to that end, I was recently had a dinner with a former high-ranking military official, and this person expressed real concern that China, this time around, invades Taiwan. What are you hearing from folks on that front?
Everyone's concerned about that because it is the hot button issue, and 90% of our high-end chips do come from one town in Taiwan.
Absolutely. Taiwan Semiconductor, of course.
But we're going to lose all that anyway. There's 4,500 single-point failures in the semiconductor supply chain system. Most of those aren't in Taiwan. So you can have a country break down anywhere in the world. and we lose the high-end semiconductors anyway. So I think we're focused on the wrong conversation. It's not that the fabs aren't important, but they're not the highest value add part of the process. They're not the most capital intensive part of the process. And they're not the most profitable part of the process. There's 4,500 other steps that matter. And we were going to lose a few of them, and that's all it takes. If China were to do it, and if they won easily, you would have some degree of sanctions and naval activity from the United States, from Japan, from Australia, from Vietnam, from someone. And that's the end of China, because this is a country that imports 3/4 of their energy.
So if that happens, they get put in a corner somewhere.
Yeah, and it's not hard. Sri Lanka could destroy the Chinese supply lines, because the Chinese don't have range. So you're looking at the end of China as an industrialized unified state if they do that. Now, 5 years ago, Chairman Xi of China realized that, and he knew it was all just drama and talk. But 5 years after he got rid of the last people who would tell him the truth, and 5 years of having nothing but rancid propaganda being your intellectual diet, that messes with your head. And so now we just don't know.
If there's a long list of risks out there in the world.
Yeah.
Russia, Ukraine, what's going on in Israel. We were just talking about China, Taiwan. I'm
not
sure,
too worried about Israel.
I'm sure, why not? I mean, I'm trying to figure out what is the biggest risk investors need to think about on the geopolitical front next year.
I mean, this is the best way I can put the Israeli stuff. Okay, so New York, big state, Texas, bigger state. We all make fun of the small states. We all agree on that, right? Rhode Island's the smallest.
Yeah.
Gaza's 1/9 the size of Rhode Island. It's just really hard for me to get excited about Gaza. I mean, what's going on there is horrible. It was horrible in last October. It's horrible now. It's just bad. But they don't produce anything. They don't consume anything. They don't transit anything. And anyone who's bringing up Palestine as an issue is doing it for a different reason, most likely. And Iran and Israel have gone out of their way to avoid a direct confrontation. Lebanon really doesn't count from a broader strategic picture. So Israel's going to be okay. A war with Iran is exceedingly unlikely. That doesn't mean that there aren't some hammers going around and doing some interesting things in Hezbollah and Syria and all that. It's interesting. It's not really economically impactful, though.
Hang with us, Peter. We're going to be right back after the short break. Welcome back to Opening Bid. Going into really diving into the world of geopolitical risks, and there's a lot out there to talk about with Peter Zeihan, New York Times bestselling author and geopolitical expert. Peter, we were off camera a little bit. We were talking very briefly on DOGE. Before we dig too much into DOGE, what does the framework of this thing look like in your view?
Okay, two things to keep in mind, both of which are Musk-centric. Number one, Musk's experience with governance is limited, and to create a new department requires an act of Congress. And let's just say that Donald Trump is an ideas guy, not a details guy.
So DOGE may not even be created.
It probably will in some form, but the idea that's going to be done in less than 6 months is a bit of a stretch. If you remember to the last non-details president we had, Barack Obama, it took a year because he just threw the whole idea of healthcare to Congress, said, work it out. This is what I want. Oh my God, the nightmare that came out of that. And now we've got a Bureau of Government Efficiency that is going to have 2 department heads. I mean, that sounds so government to me. Mm-hmm. So, this is going to take a longer time. And the fat, if that's the right word, in the federal budget isn't in discretionary spending, it's in entitlements. And Donald Trump has been made it very, very clear through his first term and through the campaign for his second term that we're going to be no meaningful changes to Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security. So you've already removed well over 80% of the potential savings from the system.
You can't just can thousands of federal employees. I mean,
exactly. That also requires an act of Congress.
These are people helping to keep literally the lights on critical functions, right?
I mean, the argument that there is savings to be made or that there's employees that are not performing, of course. But the idea that you can just, with a stroke of a pen, change that? No, this requires Congress, dedicated efforts from Congress. The last president who tried to do this was Jimmy Carter. He spent 2.5 years working on it, and he reduced the amount of time that it took to fire a federal employee from 14 months to 7.
That's great.
And that's when the president is focused on it. Trump doesn't focus.
So how do international folks you talk to view Elon Musk? Some say he's a shadow president. I mean, I think I understand what they're saying, but that's not exactly what he is. But how do they view him?
They see him as an oligarch of the Gilded Age style, the railroad robber barons, if you will, and that he is using government policy to advance his corporate interests, and I think that's broadly an accurate assessment.
So they don't view him as an innovator, not and good for the world.
You can be both. Yeah. Now, Tesla from an environmental point of view, but that's an EV issue. The fact that he is already looking to investigate financial aid from things like the Inflation Reduction Act that are going into his competitors, but onto Tesla, I find hilarious. But I mean, honestly, we should have seen that coming.
What is the biggest risk in the United States that you think people are not focusing enough on?
We're looking at demographic collapse in China, Korea, Japan, Germany, Italy, all within the next 10 years.
What do you mean demographic collapse?
These countries have had birth rates for so low for so long that in all cases they have more people above age 50 than below age 50. And if you fast forward 10 years, they're going to almost have more people above age 60 than below age 60, and we don't have an economic model that works for that. So,
well, Elon would say just have more kids.
Yeah, it's great. If you start now, you'll get 30-year-olds in 31 years.
Yeah.
We don't have that kind of time. And if we're going to rule out immigration, and that scale of immigration for these countries is not possible anymore, they need a new economic model. And if you think back on your history, the last couple times that the Germans tried a new economic model, we had some arguments. Doing that for countries the size of China, I mean, we're looking at not just an economic breakdown and a national collapse, we're looking at the end of a civilizational model here. There's no one alive who's lived through that, and the closest thing we have in a historical comparison is like the German civil wars of the 1840s. Those were pretty rough. What happens to a country when they lose their entire tax base, their entire investment base, and their entire workforce?
What does happen?
Great question. We don't know. It's never happened. We're going to see it in a lot of places very soon.
Are you seeing countries put any measures in to reverse this? Because this sounds dreadful.
It's the only country that has kind of prepped some ground for this is Japan. They realized this was happening back in the 80s. They found ways to boost the birth rate a little bit. They found ways to extend the working age a little bit. And they're no longer in the worst position. They're still the oldest country demographically. They're still on this path. But there are now a dozen countries ranging from China to Spain to Poland that are aging much faster. So the first countries to go down are going to be Italy and Korea. I have more faith in the Koreans adapting out of this than I do the Italians.
So go down, you mean economic collapse?
Yeah, according to the rules we understand. The biggest countries to go down on a only slightly longer time frame are China and Germany.
How does, incoming President Trump is really locked in on mass deportations. How does that, and if we're dealing with an aging population here in the U.S., how does that impact the situation?
Well, let me give you the good side and then the bad side. So the good side. We are aging, but we're aging more slowly than everyone else. And if we keep aging at our current rate, we're not going to face a German-style problem until about 2070. And that assumes that we
I won't be here.
Yeah, that assumes we don't restart immigration, which we will. We go in phases. We're just at a low point right now. The bad side, based on whose numbers you're using, we're talking about somewhere between 7 and 14 million people, about 2/3 of which are workers. We have the lowest unemployment rate in American history right now, and if you were to remove several million workers from the workforce, we would instantly get to 10% inflation, probably significantly higher. And if you want to prepare for a post-China world, we need to expand our industrial plant. A lot of the folks that are migrants are working in construction. It's their single largest concentration. So removing this labor from the market means ongoing dependence on China, knowing that we can see the end of that system and just preparing ourselves for a really horrible shock down the road.
When does that shock happen? Is it hard to predict these things?
Well, again, n equals 0. We've never had this before. We have seen Chinese labor costs increase by about a factor of 15 over the last 25 years. That's the fastest increase in history, faster than in any war, faster than the Black Death. So they're no longer cost effective as a manufacturing power, and that is helping move things away. Trump in Trump 1 changed the conversation in the United States. started a reindustrialization process. Biden, with some of his industrial policies, accelerated that. Trump, with what he wants to do now, suggested it'll accelerate again. These are all good things because it's all getting us moving in the right direction, but we have a lot of work to do.
Somewhat related, and I'm thinking of this because I'm about to have a conversation with Mark Benioff, of course, the CEO of Salesforce, and we're going to be talking about these digital agents powering the economy. What's your views on AI, and how will that change the world order and create new risks, but also create new opportunities?
I have a mostly positive view because I think it's going to take a lot longer than people think. I mean, we need every incremental gain in efficiency to stretch every bit of capital and every man hour we can further during this transition where we need to do our build out. So apply everything you can. But I don't think we're going to be able to make the chips. Remember, 90% in Taiwan, 4,500 single point failures in the supply chain system. We're just not going to be able to make the volume that we need to apply this as much as we want. Now, the model for tech has already changed. To really push a broad envelope of tech expansion, you need a huge amount of capital to fund everything from the design to the operationalization, and you need a huge number of people in their 20s and their 30s who are networked together and willing to work with one another in order to imagine the future. Well, the capital is gone because the baby boomers have already liquidated 2/3 of their savings, and it's moved into low velocity stuff, so it's just not there anymore to fuel tech. That's why we've seen capital costs go up. It's not Biden, it's not Trump, it's not the business cycle, it's the boomers. And then the millennials, the oldest millennials are 45 now.
Yeah.
They're not the young bucks anymore. And the next generation down, Gen Z, is not just smaller, they're wildly antisocial. Mm-hmm. And so they can code, which is one of the first jobs AI is going to take, by the way, yeah. But they don't work well as groups. So we're kind of stuck with the technology set we have now. And we can apply that in any number of ways. But the idea that there's a whole technology suite that's going to erupt on the scene in 5 and 10 years, I don't think so.
In the last 2 minutes, we always like to ask our guests their hot takes, and I want to stay on the AI for this. I suspect you may have a spicy take on this one. Do you worry about an AI-driven militarized, or an AI-driven military, where we're going to battle with robots here? I mean, there's some signs of this now, but this is in my head because we had a team talking about humanoid robots, and like this stuff is here. I mean, is that the future we're looking at, and does that scare the hell out of you?
I don't think it's the future we're working at for this decade or next decade. This is a question for the 2040s when we have sufficient chips to actually install them in systems. Keep in mind that for AI to function in that way, it has to be autonomous, and that means not having to link back to a server farm. So everything we're doing now with large language models or soon large movement models still requires that live link. Otherwise, you're stuck with the hardware that's in the specific robot. And we don't have the volume of chips, we don't have the sophistication of chips, and the time frame that it takes to design a chip and get it into mass production, that's about a 7-year process. Because you first have to design it, that's a couple years, and then you do a test run at a fab, that's a couple years, and only then can you start producing them at scale. So we will see more and more of this in systems, especially on the edges, but it still has to be linked back. So if you're in a position where you say have a small server cluster on a carrier and a drone factory on a carrier, as long as that carrier can maintain its wireless connections, to its arms, if you will, then that's a very powerful force. But the idea that you can launch 1,000 missiles over the horizon and they're just going to do what needs to be done, no, we're not there yet.
All right, you left me feeling hopeful. We will not see Rambo robots just yet.
Not yet.
All right, not yet. Peter Zeihan, New York Times bestselling author and geopolitical expert. Good to see you. Loved your thoughts. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, and that is it for the latest episode of Opening Bid. We'll talk to you soon.